Admiral James Foster stared at the tactical display aboard the HS Defiant, flagship of the human defense fleet. The holographic projection showed 57 human warships, all that remained of Earth's once mighty armada, positioned in a defensive formation around the Vega star system. Behind them lay 7 inhabited planets belonging to 3 different alien species who had once looked down upon humanity as primitive and barbaric. How quickly the tables had turned. "Status report," Foster demanded, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of the display. Commander Anna Reed approached, datapad in hand. "The Void Swarm has destroyed the outer sensor array. Based on previous patterns, we have less than 6 hours before they arrive." Foster nodded grimly. The Void Swarm, a hive-mind entity of millions of biomechanical ships, had emerged from the galactic core 3 years ago. They consumed everything in their path. Planets, stars, entire civilizations. The more advanced a society, the more the swarm seemed drawn to it. Humanity, with its comparatively primitive technology, had been initially overlooked. But when the swarm began decimating the elder races, the telepathic Luminar, the crystalline Prism Collective, and the gaseous Mistwalkers, humans had made a choice that shocked the galactic community. They chose to fight. "Admiral," Reed continued, "the evacuation of the Luminar homeworld is at 86%. The Prism families are at 92%. The Mistwalkers," she hesitated, "they're refusing to leave." Foster sighed. "Patch me through to Elder Cloud." The main screen flickered to life, showing a swirling blue-gray mass that vaguely resembled a humanoid form. The Mistwalkers had once called humans oxygen-breathing bacteria and had protested their admission to the Galactic Council. "Elder Cloud," Foster began, "we cannot hold the swarm indefinitely. Your people must evacuate." The misty figure pulsed with light. "We have existed for 8 million years, Admiral. We will not flee like frightened animals. With respect, Elder, we've seen what the swarm does. There won't be anything left of your civilization. Not your art, your history, nothing. The evacuation ships can preserve at least some of your people." Foster didn't add what both of them knew, that humanity was using its own colony ships for these evacuations, ships that could have saved more humans instead. "Why do you do this, Admiral?" Elder Cloud's form rippled. "Your species owes us nothing. Many of us oppose your very presence in this sector of space." Foster's mind flashed to Earth. Beautiful, blue, now a barren rock stripped of all life by the Void Swarm's first major incursion into human space. Humanity had lost its cradle, but they had colony worlds, deep space habitats, and most importantly, their military fleet had been deployed elsewhere. "Because this is who we are," Foster replied simply. "We fight for those who cannot." A junior officer interrupted. "Admiral, the swarm has accelerated. New estimate puts them at our position in 3 hours." Foster straightened his uniform. "Understood. Elder Cloud, I respect your people's decision, but my offer stands until the last possible moment." As the communication ended, Foster turned to his crew, men and women who had volunteered for what was effectively a suicide mission. "All ships, battle stations, deploy the resonance mines at the calculated entry points. Cruiser groups A through D form the forward line. Destroyer groups will maintain the secondary perimeter." He paused. "We are humanity's final fleet, and we stand between these civilizations and extinction. Let's show the galaxy why they should have feared us instead of the swarm." Throughout the fleet, humans prepared for battle. Engineers making final weapon calibrations, pilots running last checks on fighters, Marines securing for combat. They knew the odds. They embraced them anyway. The first wave of the Void Swarm arrived exactly as predicted, a writhing mass of obsidian ships that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. They poured through the designated entry points like a flood of darkness. "Resonance mines detonating," reported Lieutenant Mark Wilson, his fingers dancing across the tactical console. 30% of first wave neutralized." Foster nodded. Launch fighter squadrons, all forward batteries, commence firing. The space between the human fleet and the swarm erupted in blinding light as rail guns, plasma cannons, and antimatter torpedoes unleashed destruction upon the incoming enemy. Human fighters, small and agile, darted between the larger swarm vessels, targeting what research had identified as vulnerable points. What humanity lacked in advanced technology, they made up for in tactical innovation and sheer tenacity. The Luminar evacuation is at 93%, Reed reported. Prism Collective at 97%. Estimated time to completion, 45 minutes. We need to buy them that time, Foster replied, watching as 3 human destroyers moved to intercept a swarm battleship that had broken through the line. The destroyers, Kingston, Yamato, and Nairobi, coordinated their attack perfectly, executing a maneuver that had been developed specifically to counter the swarm's predictable patterns. The Kingston and Yamato flanked the massive enemy vessel, drawing its attention and fire while the Nairobi approached from below, launching its payload directly into the enemy's propulsion system. The swarm battleship shuddered, then exploded in a cascade of dark matter reactions that temporarily created a void in space itself. The Nairobi couldn't pull away in time and was caught in the implosion. Foster closed his eyes briefly. 300 souls, he murmured. Add them to the memorial. On the tactical display, red dots representing swarm ships continued to pour into the system. For every one they destroyed, 5 more appeared. Admiral, Wilson called out, the swarm is adapting to our mind frequencies. Effectiveness dropping to 15%. Rotate the resonance patterns according to Protocol Sigma, Foster ordered. And inform all ships, we go to Phase 2. Phase 2 was riskier. It required half the fleet to create a tight defensive sphere around the evacuation corridor, while the other half engaged in aggressive hit-and-run attacks to draw the swarm away. It would split their forces, but simulations showed it was the only way to ensure the evacuation ships could escape. As the orders went out, Foster received an unexpected communication. Admiral, came the voice of Captain Lisa Torres from the heavy cruiser Johannesburg. We've got movement from the Mistwalker homeworld. Foster frowned. Are they evacuating? No, sir. They're launching ships. Hundreds of them. The tactical display updated to show swirling blue-gray vessels rising from the gaseous planet. Ancient ships that looked more like living clouds than mechanical constructs. Elder Cloud's image appeared once more on the main screen. We have reconsidered, Admiral. While most of our people remain, we send our youngest to join your evacuation. Thank you, Elder, Foster replied, genuinely moved. Do not misunderstand. The Mistwalker continued. We have also decided that if we are to face extinction, we will do so in battle, not hiding in our atmosphere. Our vessels are antiquated by galactic standards, but they were once feared across 3 spiral arms. Foster smiled for the first time in days. Form your ships on our eastern flank, Elder. Let's show the swarm what an alliance of the willing can do. As the Mistwalker ships moved into position, the Void Swarm seemed to hesitate, as if calculating this new variable. It was all the opening the human fleet needed. All ships, Foster commanded. Execute Operation Hammer and Anvil. The space above the Luminar homeworld transformed into a chaotic ballet of destruction. Human warships, utilizing their superior maneuverability, executed complex formations that the hive mind of the swarm struggled to predict. Meanwhile, the ancient vessels of the Mistwalkers proved surprisingly effective. Their gaseous construction made them difficult targets for the swarm's energy weapons. Evacuation status, Foster demanded, gripping the edge of the tactical table as the Defiant shuddered under enemy fire. Luminar at 98%, Prism Collective complete, Reed reported. The evacuation corridor is holding, but thinly. The corridor was a heavily defended route through which civilian ships were escaping the system. Every few minutes, another transport loaded with refugees would accelerate to FTL speed, carrying the remnants of once mighty civilizations to safety. "Sir," Wilson interrupted, "the swarm is launching something new, smaller units, faster than anything we've seen before." The tactical display showed hundreds of dart-like objects breaking away from the main swarm fleet. "They're heading straight for the evacuation corridor," Reed said, her voice tight. Foster made a quick decision. "Redirect fighter squadrons Gold and Silver to intercept. And contact Captain Gray. I need the Dresden and the Cairo to reinforce that sector." "The Dresden was lost 10 minutes ago, sir," Wilson said quietly. Foster absorbed the blow without flinching. "The Delhi, then." As orders were relayed, something unexpected happened. A communication came through from the Luminar evacuation ship carrying their high counselors. "Admiral Foster," spoke a melodic voice belonging to First Counselor Lyra, her translucent features appearing on screen. "We have been monitoring your battle coordination." "First Counselor, your ship should have jumped to safety already," Foster replied, concerned. "We remain to offer assistance," Lyra explained. "Our people possess no weapons, but our telepathic abilities may be of use. With your permission, we will attempt to disrupt the swarm's collective consciousness." Foster hesitated only briefly. The Luminar had always kept their telepathic abilities shrouded in mystery, using them primarily for communication and artistic expression. The idea that they might weaponize this gift was unprecedented. "Any assistance would be welcome, Counselor, but I don't want to risk your leadership." "The risk is necessary," Lyra replied with quiet dignity. "We have observed how humanity fights for others without calculation of benefit. We would do no less." Within moments, the effects became visible. The smaller swarm units, the darts heading for the evacuation corridor, began to move erratically. Some collided with each other, while others veered off course entirely. "It's working," Reed breathed in amazement. The reprieve was short-lived. The main swarm fleet seemed to shudder collectively, then resume its advance with renewed coordination. "They've isolated the telepathic intrusion," Wilson reported grimly. "And they're responding. 3 capital ships breaking off, heading directly for the Luminar vessel." Foster didn't hesitate. "Intercept course, maximum speed. All batteries prepare to fire on my mark." The Defiant surged forward, accompanied by 2 destroyers, placing themselves between the swarm and the vulnerable Luminar ship. What followed was one of the most intense exchanges of the battle, with the human ships absorbing punishment meant for the aliens they had once considered aloof and unhelpful allies. As the Defiant's shields failed and hull breaches were reported on multiple decks, the Luminar ship finally jumped to safety. Their last transmission was brief but heartfelt. "We will remember this day, Admiral. Humanity's stand will be written in our histories for all time." Foster allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before turning his attention back to the battle. The evacuation was nearly complete, but the cost had been staggering. Nearly 20 human ships destroyed, with the rest heavily damaged. A new alert sounded. "Admiral," Reed called out, "the Prism Collective is transmitting data. They'd been analyzing the swarm's movement patterns and believe they found a vulnerability." Foster studied the information with cautious hope. The crystalline Prism beings had always been renowned for their analytical abilities. If anyone could find a weakness in the seemingly unstoppable swarm, it would be them. "Signal all remaining ships," Foster ordered. "We're implementing a new strategy." The vulnerability the Prism Collective had identified was subtle, a resonance frequency that disrupted the swarm's ability to communicate across short distances. It wasn't enough to destroy them, but it created brief windows of confusion that the human fleet could exploit. All ships with functioning EMP cannons, modified to frequency 347.8, and fire in coordinated bursts, Foster instructed. "Fighter wings, prepare to exploit the disruption windows. Target their command nodes specifically." The human fleet, though diminished, executed the new strategy with precision. When the modified EMP bursts hit a cluster of swarm ships, they would momentarily lose coordination. just long enough for human fighters and missiles to strike critical systems. "It's working," Wilson reported, a hint of hope in his voice for the first time. "Swarm destruction rate up by 40%. Foster nodded grimly. "That still leaves us outnumbered 100-1. "Sir," Reed interjected, "final Luminar evacuation ship is away. All civilian vessels have cleared the system." A collective sigh of relief passed through the bridge crew, quickly tempered by the reality of their situation. The mission to protect the evacuation was complete, but the Defiant and the remaining human vessels were now effectively trapped behind enemy lines with severely depleted resources. "New contacts approaching from Sector 7, Wilson suddenly announced. "Configuration unknown." Foster tensed, expecting a new swarm variant. Instead, the tactical display showed sleek vessels with a distinctive design that made his eyes widen in surprise. "Those are human ships," he said in disbelief. "Colonial Defense Force signatures." The comm system crackled. "Attention HS Defiant and all fleet vessels. This is Admiral Maria Lopes of the Mars Colonial Defense Force. We've brought some friends. Hold position and prepare for reinforcement." Behind Lopez's squadron appeared an astonishing sight. Hundreds of vessels representing a dozen different species, the insectoid hive builders, the silicon-based crust dwellers, even the notoriously isolationist pod clans, species that had fled rather than fight when the swarm first appeared. "Admiral Foster," Lopes continued, "the evacuation ships reached the rally point and told us what humanity was doing here. The galactic community has reconsidered its position on intervention." Foster exchanged glances with Reed, both of them processing this unexpected development. "We also bring technology," Lopes added. "The crust dwellers have adapted their planetary shield systems for ship-to-ship combat. The hive builders have compatible weapon schematics. Transmitting now." As the data flowed in, Foster's tactical officers scrambled to integrate the new capabilities into their damaged systems. The Defiant's chief engineer reported that the shield modifications would take 30 minutes to implement, time they didn't have as another wave of swarm ships closed in. "We'll buy you that time," Foster decided. "All remaining human vessels, form up on the Defiant. We're going to punch a hole in their formation to allow our reinforcements through." It was a desperate gambit, but Foster knew his captains would understand the necessity. The surviving human ships, battered, leaking atmosphere, running on emergency power in many cases, formed a spearhead formation. "All ships," Foster commanded, "divert all power to forward shields and engines. We go in hard and fast." The human spearhead accelerated toward the densest part of the swarm blockade. Point defense systems worked overtime to clear smaller threats, while the capital ships absorbed staggering amounts of damage. 3 more human vessels were lost in the charge, their sacrifice creating the breach needed for Lopez's coalition fleet to pour through. As they did, they deployed modified shield technology that enveloped the surviving human ships. "Shield integration complete," Reed reported with barely contained excitement. "Admiral Lopes is requesting joint tactical command." Foster nodded. "Granted. Let's make this count." For the first time since the battle began, the tide started to turn. The coalition fleet brought not just numbers but technological adaptations specifically designed to counter the swarm based on data gathered from previous encounters across the galaxy. As Foster coordinated with Lopes, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony. Humanity, the youngest, most primitive spacefaring species, had inspired the older races not through superior technology or wisdom, but through sheer determination and a willingness to sacrifice for others. "Sir," Wilson reported, "the swarm is retreating. They're pulling back to regroup." Foster studied the tactical display with cautious optimism. "They're adapting, preparing a new strategy." But so,